Dear friends, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 109th Presidium meeting of EUROMIL in Lisbon. First of all, I want to thank EUROMIL's Portuguese member associations for hosting this Presidium meeting. To be correct, I should say hosting once again EUROMIL's Presidium meeting, because EUROMIL was already several times a guest in your beautiful country. Although EUROMIL's presence here was not always wanted or needed, we just love to be in Lisbon and enjoy your famous hospitality. On several occasions, we participated on invitation of one or several of our member associations in events related to the particular situation that Portuguese military personnel were facing. In particular, I remember the period from 2006 to 2007 as a very difficult one. After several disciplinary and juridical problems that followed the demonstration in Lisbon in May 2006, a solidarity meeting with Portuguese soldiers was organized on the 10th of January 2007. And I remember that we participated at this event together with Irish and Spanish colleagues, and EUROMIL at that time condemned the way that Portuguese soldiers were treated, namely as a second-class citizen. Despite of the fact that several years ago the right of association was legally granted to Portuguese military personnel, we came to the conclusion that this legal right was nothing more than an empty box. At that time, EUROMIL urged the authorities to confirm the legal right of association by a right of participation. Because only in this way, Portuguese associations could play their fundamental role in favor of military personnel, their families, and the armed forces. EUROMIL was at that time shocked by the fact that several soldiers had to face disciplinary and juridical proceedings to defend their social and moral interest, and we were of the opinion that these kind of reactions and radical measures were out of all proportion, and they should be condemned by the international community. EUROMIL called on the Portuguese government to give the necessary orders to recognize military associations as representative organizations and grant them all the perks to go with this position. And I will always remember the closing of that meeting when about 15 accused colleagues were presented to participants. This was one of these very emotional moments that I will never forget, because every time it reminds me why we represent military personnel and our armed forces. We should be proud that EUROMIL favors the dialogue instead of confrontation. We tried at that time to mediate through contacts with the defense minister, politicians, visits and letters sent to Portuguese ambassadors all over Europe, and I can only hope that we were a part of the solution. Dear guests, dear friends, time went by and things changed. Nothing is perfect, and things can of course always be better. But the fact that ongoing reforms of most of the European armed forces were suddenly also confronted to the consequences of the economic and financial crisis did not make things easier. No one will deny that the crisis had and still has a negative influence on defense budgets and the functioning of our European armed forces. But we should ask ourselves if only the financial crisis is to blame for this malaise. Allow me to remind you that in several European countries, the spending on the military is in decline since almost 20 years. This means that beside the financial economic problem, there is also another basic element that influences the functioning of the armed forces, namely a political problem. After the Cold War, several governments reformed their armed forces. Firstly, the need to reform was justified by a change of geopolitical situation. Although this was a correct reaction, one has also to admit that most of these governments saw at that point the opportunity to reduce their armed forces in numbers and especially to decrease their defense budgets. But despite these budget cuts, the total defense expenditure of the 26 European Defense Agency, or EDA, member states in 2012, and I remind you that Denmark is not an EDA member and Croatia only joined in 2013, this still amounted to almost 190 billion euro. And it was anyway a reduction of 1.1 billion euro compared to 2011. And from 2006 to 2011, total defense expenditure decreased by 21 billion euro, or almost 10%. And between 2011 and 2012, by almost further 3%. A second issue that can bring us to the point to declare that the state of defense policy in Europe is critical is the loss of will of several European governments to use military force compared to the past. Again, according to EDA, EU member states had over 80,000 soldiers deployed on external operations in 2008. Meanwhile, this number has fallen to almost 50,000 in 2012. One can also predict that these numbers will even decrease more when troops are drawn down from Afghanistan during or after 2014. Ladies and gentlemen, despite these two essential elements, decreasing budget and troops, the EU 28 collectively still spent as much on defense as Russia and China combined. The EDA declared that the EU 28 can deploy some 100,000 troops on external operations. But nevertheless, this is only a quarter of what the US can deploy, even with more soldiers available in the EU 28 than in the US. And although we know that, for example, China's defense expenditure will almost certainly exceed that of the EU 28 before 2020, Europe still has a solid base of military capabilities and experiences to build on. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, looking back to the result of the European Council Summit of December 2013, it seems that everybody knows the problems and even the solutions, but that not all governments are interested in cooperating. It will be a challenge to push European governments towards a sense of common European interest, and no longer only into their national interest and sovereignty. The development of European military cooperation must be more than a wish to find a solution to spend less military budgets. But we are already happy that one of the conclusions of this summit is that the defense matter will be back on the agenda of a council meeting in 2015. And allow me to quote German MEP Michael Gahler, who is a strong supporter of EUROMIL and a defender of soldiers' rights in the European Parliament. In the latest issue of the European Security and Defense magazine, and I quote Michael Gahler, "There is always a next summit." I personally, and I hope also EUROMIL, share his opinion that the next European Parliament needs to be equipped with a stronger mandate if it is to be a driving force, political advocate, and monitoring body that advances development of the common security and defense policy. That these developments can and must be discussed in agreement with NATO, which will also soon update its own political and strategic principles, is undeniable. I think that it's not overreacting when we see, for example, the Ukraine crisis as a wake-up call. Arriving for EU defense ministers' talks in Luxembourg on the 15th of April, NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen said that the Ukraine crisis has amplified the need to strengthen cooperation between NATO, the European Union and close partners. And I quote, "We need to train and exercise more together. For instance, the NATO Response Force and the EU battle groups, so that we stand ready for whatever the future may bring. As we prepare for our Wales Summit in September, we have to ensure that we continue to invest in our security. Every ally has a part to play in this effort. NATO keeps us all secure, and we must all continue investing to keep NATO strong." Mr. Fogh Rasmussen continued. This situation makes it once again clear that we must act in common agreement within the European Union and in collaboration with NATO. But in review of the 2013 December summit, it was EUROMIL's position that the European Council should not exclude the human factor from its discussion on defense. EUROMIL supports a comprehensive and indivisible approach to security, which includes, among others, a human dimension. Military personnel put their lives at risk for the preservation of some European values and must be treated as citizens in uniform. They deserve the best living and working conditions as any other EU citizen. This implies the need for soldiers serving in EU missions to receive proper training, equipment, and have access to medical facilities as well as social protection. Indeed, EUROMIL calls for deeper cooperation and harmonization among EU armed forces, not only to what concerns pooling and sharing of capabilities, but also for the development of common standards for living and working conditions of armed forces personnel. And in this regard, EUROMIL recalls the SAFE project, Synchronized Armed Forces Europe, launched in 2008 by a former President of the European Parliament, Dr. Hans-Gert Pöttering. The SAFE project aimed for a dynamic development of the cooperation of national armed forces towards a closer synchronization and increased Europe-wide division of labor, based on the principle that those who serve together should also train together. Moreover, too many breaches of basic human rights of servicemen and women are still reported in European countries. EUROMIL therefore calls on all EU member states to abide by international legislation and respect the fundamental rights and freedoms, including the freedom of association of their members of the armed forces. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, the task of EUROMIL is to promote the social and professional conditions of every single European soldier. We have been doing so since 1972, and we will continue to do so in the future, even if the road is difficult. We must be aware that many challenges will be part of our future, but it's my strong belief that EUROMIL, together with its national representative partners, must and will be part of this future European defense community. Together, we are the best guarantee for European defense forces with well-motivated, socio-economically protected personnel. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, before I close my opening speech, I would ask you for a minute of silence to salute and honor our military colleagues from all over the world who lost their life while serving their country, serving their fellow citizens, and protecting our freedom. But also allow me to use this moment of silence to remember and honor our old friend Valerian Nestor. Valerian died recently at the age of 84 years old, and we are grateful for everything he did for his colleagues in Russia, and in particular for what he did and meant for Europe. I invite you to stand up for this minute of silence.